What happens when a man is reduced to a racial stereotype by someone sworn to serve and protect? Today, you'll see how one aerospace engineer turned humiliation into a nationwide lesson in justice. Stay with us, because this story is about courage, strategy, and a reckoning no one saw coming. Daniel Thompson was having what should have been an ordinary Tuesday. At 34, he had already built a life that many envied. An MIT-educated aerospace engineer, the owner of a technology consulting firm that brought in millions. A man who thrived on structure, logic, and precision. Traffic stops were routine, almost mundane in his daily commute, and he never imagined that a simple routine pullover could become a moment that would shatter his sense of control and ignite a fire within him. That afternoon, as he drove his sleek BMW down a sunlit street, the flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror signaled a brief interruption to his ordinary life. The officer who approached his car exuded confidence, but there was something about the way she carried herself that immediately put him on edge. Jennifer Walsh, a woman in her early 30s, smiled at him as if he were a child being scolded, a condescending curl of her lips that sent an icy shiver down his spine. She handed him a ticket, $300 for exceeding the speed limit by a few miles per hour, but it wasn't the fine that made Daniel's stomach twist. It was the words that followed, words that stripped him of dignity in a way no traffic stop should ever permit. "If you weren't married, I'd give you my number," she said, leaning casually against his car, eyes deliberately scanning the interior before settling on his face. Her gaze lingered in a way that made it clear this was not a compliment. It was a calculated assertion of power. "I've always had a thing for exotic men." The word exotic hung in the air, heavy and sharp, a slap that reverberated deep in Daniel's mind. For a brief moment, Daniel was stunned. He blinked, attempting to process the audacity of her statement, the casual arrogance with which she wielded her position as authority. 15 years in the corporate world had honed his ability to identify subtle prejudice, to recognize racism disguised as admiration. He knew immediately that this was not admiration. It was fetishization. An objectification grounded in racial bias, and worse. It was wrapped in the shield of a uniform and a badge. Despite the whirlwind of emotion threatening to surface, Daniel remained calm. His hand, almost on instinct, reached for the recording device in his pocket, ensuring that he captured every word, every nuance of the encounter. He took the business card she slid across the window, placing it in the center console without even glancing at it. As he drove away, his mind churned, not with fear, not with anger, but with a clarity that came from the knowledge that he had been deliberately demeaned, reduced to a stereotype by someone who had sworn to protect and serve. By the time Daniel pulled into his driveway, the simmering mix of humiliation and resolve had crystallized into a plan. This was more than a traffic stop. It was a statement of entitlement, a microcosm of a systemic issue he had rarely confronted directly. He wasn't angry merely because of the ticket or her words. He was furious because Walsh had assumed that her badge granted her dominion over his dignity, that a man of his accomplishments could somehow be objectified without consequence. At home, Monica, his wife of 15 years, immediately sensed the shift. She had learned to read the subtle changes in his demeanor, the quiet intensity in his voice that preceded decisive action. "What happened?" she asked, concern etched on her face. Daniel's reply was calm, almost soothing on the surface, but it carried the weight of someone who had begun calculating a course of action with precision. Monica recognized the tone, the one that indicated he was not simply upset, but planning. For the next 72 hours, Daniel immersed himself in research, his engineer's mind approaching the situation with meticulous care. Social media became a trove of damning information. He discovered that Officer Walsh had a disturbing pattern of behavior. Posts fetishizing black men, images framed as casual social interactions yet laced with undertones of objectification, and captions cloaked in the rhetoric of diversity and appreciation for different cultures. Anonymous accounts from men who had been stopped by her described harassment, predatory comments, and the manipulation of authority to coerce compliance or silence resistance. Daniel realized the horrifying extent of her actions. This wasn't an isolated incident born of arrogance or ignorance. It was systematic. A carefully cultivated misuse of power, an abuse of trust and responsibility that left victims disempowered, fearful, and largely unheard. Most men had reported nothing, believing that their voices would vanish against the weight of institutional authority. And yet here Daniel was, equipped with evidence, insight, and a resolve to act as he compiled screenshots, recorded conversations, and documented patterns of misconduct. Daniel felt a strange sense of empowerment. He had been humiliated, yes, but the humiliation was a catalyst. Each piece of information he collected strengthened his conviction. He was not merely a victim of one woman's bias. He was now a witness to a broader pattern of abuse, a man poised to challenge a system that allowed such behavior to fester unchecked. In those early hours of investigation, Daniel transformed what could have been passive resentment into strategic determination. He understood that change required more than emotion. It required methodical action, evidence, and a plan. What had begun as a humiliating traffic stop on a Tuesday afternoon had now become the spark for something far greater, something that would expose corruption, challenge prejudice, and reclaim not only his dignity, but the dignity of countless others who had suffered in silence. By Thursday night, Daniel had gathered enough initial evidence to understand the magnitude of what he was dealing with, and he shared everything with Monica. Screenshots of social media posts, photos, anonymous testimonies, and his secretly recorded traffic stop were laid out on the kitchen table. Monica's shock was immediate and visceral. Her hands trembled slightly as she scrolled through the images and read the messages, her mind racing to process the boldness and cruelty displayed by Officer Jennifer Walsh. But Daniel's focus was elsewhere. He had moved beyond shock. His mind was already calculating the next steps, mapping the path from humiliation to accountability. Recognizing the severity of the abuse, Daniel called his older brother Marcus, a civil rights lawyer renowned for his meticulous approach and impressive track record in Los Angeles. Marcus had built a reputation on exposing systematic discrimination and holding powerful institutions accountable. Within days, he arrived in Denver, carrying his professional calm and an unshakable determination that only heightened Daniel's own resolve. The brothers sat together, opening laptops, spreading printed screenshots, and analyzing every detail. Every post, message, and social media comment was scrutinized. They categorized Officer Walsh's actions as sexual harassment, abuse of authority, racial discrimination, and outright criminal misconduct. Each discovery added weight to a growing dossier that would leave no room for dismissal. The harassment escalated when Walsh somehow obtained Daniel's personal number. Her messages were brazen, crossing boundaries that should have been inviolable. "Hi, exotic babe. Still thinking about me?" One text read, dripping with predatory intent. Another was subtler, but no less threatening. "You know I can make your life very difficult, right, sweetie? Police officers have many ways of finding people we're interested in." These were not idle flirtations. They were calculated threats disguised as flirtation, an attempt to assert power and instill fear. Daniel documented every single interaction, capturing timestamps and preserving copies. Anger didn't drive him. Methodical logic, honed over years in engineering and business, guided every step. He knew that in this battle, precision would be his greatest weapon. Over the next 48 hours, Marcus initiated what he termed Operation Honeypot. He created a fake Instagram account, designing it as the profile of a recently divorced, successful lawyer from Los Angeles. Every detail was crafted to be credible, every post intentional, every profile picture chosen to attract the type of attention that Walsh had consistently sought. The trap was set, and it didn't take long for Walsh to take the bait. Within hours, she was messaging the fake profile, revealing her methods, preferences, and predatory behavior with a candor that even Marcus had not anticipated. Through these messages, the depth of her misconduct became undeniable. Walsh spoke openly about collecting black men, coercing them during traffic stops, and using her authority to manipulate and intimidate. She even shared intimate images that were clearly non-consensual, exposing not just harassment, but serious violations of federal law. Every word, every image, every confession she sent added layers to a case that now went far beyond individual grievance. It revealed a network of abuse, a systematic exploitation of trust and power, and the way privilege could shield misconduct from scrutiny. Daniel and Marcus realized that they were no longer dealing merely with harassment. They were uncovering corruption entrenched within a law enforcement system, a predator hiding behind a badge. The combination of engineering precision and legal expertise turned their approach into a machine. Each piece of evidence verified, documented and cross-referenced to reveal patterns, connections, and the full scale of abuse. Screenshots from social media confirmed the messages. Private accounts from former victims corroborated the methods. And every communication from Walsh herself documented intent and consciousness of wrongdoing. The brothers worked late into the night, creating a chronological map of her actions. From the initial traffic stop to the escalation of direct messages, the pattern was clear. Walsh had weaponized her position repeatedly, targeting men who were vulnerable in ways that no one dared speak about. And now, thanks to Daniel's foresight in recording the encounter and Marcus's legal acumen, every word was documented, every action traceable, and every crime provable. By the end of the second day, their folder of evidence had grown into a meticulously organized dossier, ready for legal scrutiny, federal reporting, and public exposure if necessary. Daniel, who had begun the week humiliated and angry, now felt a deep sense of purpose. What had started as a single, demeaning encounter had transformed into a plan not just for justice for himself, but for all the men Walsh had exploited. It was the beginning of something much larger, a calculated, methodical response to abuse of power, and the first step in holding a predator accountable. In the quiet of the night, Daniel reflected on the paradox of the situation. The very arrogance that Walsh had relied upon, her confidence that no one would dare challenge her, had made her vulnerable. She had created a trail of evidence so extensive that it would be impossible to dismiss. The next phase would require precision, courage, and timing. But for now, Daniel and Marcus had achieved something vital. They had turned humiliation into evidence, confusion into clarity, and abuse into an opportunity for justice. 3 weeks remained until Denver's highly anticipated citywide diversity and inclusion event, an occasion designed to celebrate and strengthen relationships between the police force and the community. For most, it was a symbol of goodwill, a stage for speeches, handshakes, and applause. For Daniel and Marcus Thompson, it had become the perfect platform for justice. Every step of their careful planning had been building toward this moment, and the event's purpose now provided a stage on which to confront and expose Officer Jennifer Walsh. Meanwhile, Walsh was growing increasingly erratic. Her previous confidence had shifted into a dangerous mix of desperation and arrogance. Messages arrived on Daniel's phone at all hours, oscillating between seduction and veiled threats. Each one was another piece of evidence, another confirmation of the pattern they had been documenting. "Hi, exotic babe. Still thinking about me," one message teased, followed hours later by a chilling warning. "You know I can make your life very difficult, right, sweetie?" Police officers have many ways of finding people we're interested in. Each word, carefully preserved, would serve as undeniable proof of not just harassment, but the abuse of authority. Daniel and Marcus reviewed everything repeatedly, ensuring that each screenshot, each recorded conversation, each social media post was categorized, verified, and ready for presentation. They were meticulous because they knew that exposing someone of Walsh's audacity required precision. This wasn't a spectacle. It was evidence-driven accountability. Every interaction she had sent, every message she had written, was about to be revealed for what it truly was. Finally, the day arrived. The Denver Municipal Theater, a grand hall capable of holding hundreds, buzzed with anticipation. Local officials, community leaders, and police department leadership filled the seats. Jennifer Walsh, radiant in her uniform and oozing confidence, stepped onto the stage as a keynote speaker, eager to share her thoughts on building closer relationships with the community. Her smile, practiced and polished, masked the storm that was about to hit. Daniel sat quietly in the fifth row, Marcus beside him, and a black briefcase resting on his lap. Every detail had been accounted for: the timing, the technical setup, and the audience's positioning. When the Q&A portion began, Daniel stood calmly and walked toward the microphone. His voice was steady, composed, carrying authority without raising volume. "Officer Walsh, I have a question about intimate relationships with the community," he said. The words hung in the air, a deliberate challenge cloaked as inquiry. Immediately, Walsh froze. Her carefully maintained confidence evaporated, her smile vanishing in an instant. She searched the room, and her eyes landed on Daniel, the man she had thought she could manipulate. Recognition flickered in her expression, followed by shock. Daniel raised his phone and connected it to the theater's audio system, the device now amplifying the messages she had sent over the past weeks. "You know I can make your life very difficult, right, sweetie?" Echoed through the hall, followed by dozens of incriminating texts and screenshots that revealed the extent of her predatory behavior. The audience murmured in disbelief, the air thick with shock and tension. Every word, every message, exposed the stark contrast between Walsh's public persona and her private conduct. Marcus stepped forward, methodically presenting the messages sent to the fake profile he had created during Operation Honeypot. The content was explicit: discussions of coercion during traffic stops, offers of sexual favors in exchange for leniency, and distribution of intimate images without consent. The implications were staggering, and the crowd quickly realized that this was not isolated misconduct. It was systematic abuse hidden behind a badge. Police officers present shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some attempted to leave, but Marcus's calm, authoritative voice halted them. "The FBI is waiting at the door," he announced. A wave of tension swept across the room as the reality of federal investigation settled in. Walsh's composure completely crumbled. She collapsed into a chair on stage, trembling, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The public, both the hundreds present and the tens of thousands watching the live stream online, bore witness to her unraveling. She had spent years weaponizing her badge to harass, intimidate, and exploit black men, believing her authority and racial bias would protect her. Now, that very same badge had become the symbol of her downfall, exposed to the community she had long pretended to serve. Daniel watched with quiet satisfaction as the audience absorbed every detail. This wasn't about vengeance, it was about accountability. He had methodically transformed humiliation into proof, abuse into documentation, and arrogance into a lesson in consequences. The exposure was comprehensive. Not only were Walsh's actions laid bare, but the network of corruption and complicity she had relied upon was now under scrutiny. Every officer mentioned in her communications, every co-conspirator, every implicit participant in her misconduct had been accounted for. The event that had been intended to celebrate inclusion and trust had instead become a public reckoning. By leveraging strategy, evidence, and timing, the Thompsons had ensured that the truth could not be ignored. Jennifer Walsh, who had once reduced others to racialized sexual stereotypes, was now herself subject to the full weight of justice in the most public way possible. Her career, her reputation, and her carefully cultivated image were shattered, leaving no room for denial or obfuscation, and as the murmurs of shock and whispers of disbelief filled the theater, Daniel knew this was just the beginning. The exposure had been surgical, precise, and irreversible. The predator had been unmasked, and a message had been sent. No one, no matter how powerful, could exploit authority with impunity. The aftermath of the Denver Municipal Theater event was swift and uncompromising. Jennifer Walsh, once confident and untouchable, was immediately suspended from the police force, her career dismantled in a matter of hours. Federal investigators had already seized the digital evidence meticulously gathered by Daniel and Marcus, and criminal charges were filed for sexual harassment, abuse of authority, distribution of non-consensual images, and racial discrimination. The ripple effect of her exposure was staggering. 17 other officers, including 3 supervisors and even a municipal judge mentioned in her messages, were investigated and subsequently indicted. Each revelation, each indictment, was a direct result of the careful, methodical documentation that Daniel had orchestrated from the moment he was humiliated on that ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Meanwhile, the victims who had suffered in silence for years finally found justice. A class-action lawsuit consolidated the experiences of the dozen men Walsh had harassed and manipulated. Compensation totaling millions of dollars was distributed among the victims, providing not only financial restitution, but also a long overdue acknowledgement of the systemic abuse they had endured. Daniel had turned his personal affront into a platform for collective redress, showing that one individual's determination, combined with strategy and evidence, could spark transformative change. Daniel's own life shifted in ways he had never anticipated. His technology consulting firm, already successful, expanded exponentially. Government contracts that had once seemed unattainable now flowed in steadily. NASA extended its partnership to include security and systems consulting, and several universities invited Daniel to speak on what he had begun calling justice engineering, the application of systematic, analytical approaches to identifying, documenting, and addressing discrimination. Daniel's reputation as a meticulous problem solver and strategic thinker earned him invitations to panels, conferences, and public forums where he shared the principles that had guided his response to Walsh's abuse. Jennifer Walsh, by contrast, became a cautionary tale in Denver and across social media platforms. Her arrogance, predation, and abuse of authority had been broadcast publicly, leaving her professional reputation in ruins. She had attempted to reduce black men, including Daniel, to objects of sexual fetishization, wielding her badge as a tool of power. In the end, those very methods had become her undoing. She was now a peripheral figure, forced into low-profile employment, a living warning that privilege and authority do not shield misconduct from accountability. For Daniel, the triumph was not born of vengeance or anger. It was born of strategy, evidence, and the transformative potential of systematic thinking. He had converted personal humiliation into a blueprint for justice, demonstrating that careful documentation, methodical analysis, and calculated exposure could dismantle even entrenched systems of abuse. The lesson extended far beyond one officer or one city. It was a model for confronting any abuse of power, anywhere it existed. 6 months later, Daniel sat in his renovated office overlooking the Denver skyline. The city below, once a backdrop to his humiliation, now reflected a life reshaped by methodical action and disciplined thought. The Thompson Protocol, as his approach had come to be called, was now being taught in law schools and activist programs nationwide. Individuals inspired by his story were learning to document, organize, and confront injustice systematically. What had started as a personal affront had evolved into a methodology capable of reshaping institutions and empowering communities. Monica watched her husband quietly from across the room, a smile of pride tracing her features. Daniel had transformed an incident designed to demean him into a tool for societal change. He had illustrated that injustice, when met with intellect, strategy, and calm determination, could be a catalyst for monumental reform. Jennifer Walsh had tried to reduce men like Daniel to objects, believing her badge granted her immunity. Instead, she had unwittingly catalyzed the creation of a blueprint for accountability, one that exposed systemic abuse and empowered victims. Daniel's story became more than a personal victory. It became a symbol of calculated justice. He demonstrated that real power lies not in retaliation, but in constructing systems that outlast individual cruelty. The world watched as the man who had once been a target of humiliation transformed his experience into enduring impact. Those who underestimated him, those who had assumed arrogance or privilege would protect them, had learned the hardest lesson. A mind disciplined by strategy and principle cannot be intimidated, manipulated, or reduced to fear. Every time Daniel addressed a class, consulted with a university, or spoke at a forum, he emphasized that the greatest revenge is not reactive, but proactive. The most powerful response to injustice is creating something so enduring, so structurally sound, that those who sought to harm you are rendered irrelevant. His office, filled with awards, letters of gratitude, and photographs documenting the city's transformation, stood as a testament to that philosophy. And while the victories were public, the most profound impact was private. Daniel had demonstrated to himself, to Monica, and to a nation watching, that personal strength coupled with strategic thinking can convert even the deepest humiliation into lasting change. Jennifer Walsh's downfall was complete, her attempts at intimidation and fetishization utterly dismantled, while Daniel's influence expanded far beyond the boundaries of Denver, inspiring generations to confront systemic injustice with intellect and courage. If this story of turning humiliation into power inspired you, subscribe to the channel for more real stories of people who turned the worst injustices into their greatest victories.